those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, will ply the tyrants to the very same, and that on fire which firely doth excel. For never resting time laid summer on the hideous winter, and confounds him there. Sap checked with frost, and lusty leaves quite gone, beauty o'ersnowed, and bareness everywhere. Then, where not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor it nor no remembrance what it was. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, leaves but their show, their substance still lives sweet. I've just shown you a recording of me reading a little bit of Shakespeare in a reconstructed accent from London from about 1600. If you'd like to learn more about how we can possibly reconstruct accents from before audio recording, I have a couple of videos on that, or you could just leave one of these comments, either's fine with me. But Shakespeare was not from London. He was from a town in Warwickshire about 100 miles from central London called Stratford-upon-Avon. So there's decent reason for thinking that Shakespeare's own personal accent might have been different from the one that's normally reconstructed for his plays. So in this video I'm going to be addressing the question, can we know much about what Shakespeare's own accent was like, and how it might have differed from the London accents that his plays might have been performed in? Now, right off the bat, I have to say that reconstructing an individual person's accent with the level of specificity that we might want is pretty much impossible, because you never know how an individual person might have, you don't know how their movements throughout their life might have impacted their accent. Plenty of famous actors are from parts of northern England, but you would never guess it by their accent because they basically speak RP or some more recent version of it. So we don't know, if Shakespeare started living a lot in London at a certain age. In that, how might that have impacted his accent? Would he have felt under pressure to assimilate to a London accent, or was that not so much of a thing back then? We can do this fairly well with certain historical figures who actually wrote phonetic descriptions of English from their own perspective. So Isaac Newton is an example of somebody who actually wrote phonetic descriptions of English, and so his accent is something that we can be a bit more specific about. But I think the best approach here is to start off by seeing what we can work out about a Warwickshire accent, about a West Midlands kind of, South West Midlands accent back then, and then see if we can say anything more specific about Shakespeare from the spelling evidence that we do have. Plenty of what Shakespeare wrote is not recorded in his own spelling because a lot of the time we just have sort of scribbled recapitulations of his plays that people wrote who weren't Shakespeare, and so spelling evidence is something that we have to be a bit careful with. Rhyming evidence is a lot more telling, but even so we don't know to what extent Shakespeare might have used rhyming conventions that he encountered in other people's poetry versus using his own instinct about what words rhymed with each other. So what are Warwickshire accents like now? Well, even now, for me as an outsider, pinning down what a Stratford accent sounds like is quite tricky. A study by Lodzikovsky pointed out that it's on a major isogloss in England, an isogloss being a border between areas where different linguistic features are used. If you go not too far north of Stratford, most people pronounce trap and bath with the same vowel phoneme, something like trap, bath, and put and cut with the same vowel phoneme, something like put and cut. South of Stratford, trap and bath have two separate vowel phonemes, as do put and cut, just like in my accent. Immediately we can say something about a Shakespeare-era Stratford accent, which is that it almost definitely had the more northern modern pattern in both cases, with trap and bath having the same vowel, and put and cut having the same vowel. This is because these are both the older patterns. Both of these phonemic splits, bath splitting from trap and cut splitting from put, happened in London during the 1600s, largely after Shakespeare died, and the way they're distributed across English dialects now strongly suggests that they radiated out from London. In other words, that the further away from London you were, the later you took on the splits. Accents Shakespeare heard during his childhood almost certainly had the Middle English and current Northern English pattern of trap and bath having the same vowel phoneme and put and cut having the same vowel phoneme. But this is just a comment on which words had which phoneme, not what the phonemes actually sounded like. If I honed in on an educated guess, it would be the modern Northern English qualities, that is the qualities that are used in maybe the most Northern English dialects. Those are something along the lines of trap, bath, and put, cut. I've talked about this in previous videos. You'll notice that I've reconstructed the put, cut vowel as having a very tense high back tongue position. It's not put, cut or put, cut. It's put, cut. Exactly how tense this vowel was in Middle English and very early Modern English has been debated by scholars. There are sound changes that happened before Shakespeare's time, pause on screen if you want to read about them, that suggest it probably had a fairly lax tongue position throughout a lot of the country in parts of the Middle English period, perhaps rather than u. These things can flip-flop back and forth over time. I'm leaning on the side of a tenser quality mainly because that's what you get in many modern West Midlands accents. U. If you were making a film set at the time, you could justify the creative decision of making this a difference between Shakespeare and his London actors. Cut it. Cut it. Or maybe towards the end of Shakespeare's life, as the foot-strut split was starting to emerge in the accents of younger London speakers. Cut it. Cut it. I say that you could make this creative decision in a film to make clear that this is nowhere near a sure thing that you'd claim in an academic journal, but it's informed enough to make as a creative decision. You'll notice there that I carried the tenseness to the vowel in it as well. This is also a high short vowel in Middle English and early Modern English, is also tense in modern West Midlands accents in a lot of situations, it, kit, sit. And the whole argument about the cut vowel being tense for Shakespeare basically applies to the kit vowel as well. The short vowel in trap and cat and bath is probably low central for our hypothetical Shakespeare. Ah, trap, cat, bath, rather than the modern southern qualities, or ah. That's mainly because this is true in many modern West Midlands accents and makes sense within the system of 5 short vowels that existed before the put-cut split. As I like to say, vowel systems tend towards being symmetrical in terms of front and back vowels, and this is more symmetrical, having this low central rather than a more front This is the pattern in, I think, most Northern English accents which lack the put-cut split. In London too, this low central was almost certainly widespread in Shakespeare's time, perhaps the most common quality then. But towards the end of Shakespeare's life, there may have been younger speakers who were beginning to use this more front quality that ended up dominating southeastern English years down the line. Cat against Shakespeare's cut. The vowels in words like dress and lot are a bit harder to pin down. In London, for at least some speakers like the phonetician Robert Robinson, probably and o, like the vowels I use in my accent. Dress, lot. This could have been the same for our hypothetical Shakespeare, or he may have had tenser qualities. Dress, lot. Either one is relatively symmetrical in terms of the overall shape of the vowel system, but the tenser qualities might have the edge if we're saying that kit and cut were quite tense. So that's the short vowels covered for the time being. Perhaps more interesting is the case of the long vowels, the vowels in the example words price, fleece, meat, face, goat, goose and mouth. In the modern West Midlands accents often connected with Shakespeare, these have become quite distinctive wide diphthongs, gliding vowels where the sound of the vowel changes a lot during its articulation. Something along the lines of price, fleece, meat, face, goat, goose, and mouth. I can't work out to what extent these sorts of vowel qualities are appropriate to Stratford today, but I'm extremely confident that they're not appropriate to Stratford in Shakespeare's time. This is the set of vowels that was affected by the Great Vowel Shift, which happened largely over the course of the 1400s and 1500s. I have a video on that as well, for more detail. By the time Shakespeare was born, the vowel shift had already happened for the most part, but only just. It had started in the East Midlands, reached London, and then probably radiated outwards from London and hit the West Midlands some time after. So these long vowels in Shakespeare's community, the community Shakespeare was born into, had probably only recently reached their immediate post-vowel shift qualities. The vowel shift seems to have had a pretty regular effect from south to north, and the major differences in how the long vowels sound in different dialects nowadays broadly exist for two reasons. One, because those vowels have drifted in different directions since the Great Vowel Shift, and two, because those dialects had different long vowel systems to begin with, and so when they went into the vowel shift, the output was different. We have lots of reason to think that the qualities of these 7 long vowels were pretty stable in Middle English, not being that different from one place to another within England. They were spelled very similarly across the country, despite Middle English spelling being pretty malleable and sensitive to large pronunciation differences. The modern descendants of these long vowels make the most sense if they were fairly similar from accent to accent in Middle English, and Middle English had lots of region-specific cases where short vowels became long and long vowels became short, which gives us a pretty reliable sense of which long vowels resembled which short vowels in quality. This relationship between short and long vowels seems to have been really similar from place to place, and the short vowels have stayed pretty stable in quality even up to today because they weren't affected by the Great Vowel Shift. This makes them a good reference point by which to judge the Middle English qualities of the long vowels. The Middle English long vowels probably had approximately the same basic qualities all the way up to about Lancashire. Something different happens further north, but that's miles away from both Stratford and London, so we can ignore that here. This all stands in contrast to nowadays, where the descendants of these long vowels are really different from one accent to another. Most of these differences have presumably arisen due to the system becoming a bit unstable after the Great Vowel Shift, and I think the pronunciation of the Middle English long vowels is now a major thing that we use to recognise what someone's accent is. That may not have been the case, in fact it probably wasn't the case in Middle English. Those Middle English long vowel qualities in about 1380 or so, in both London and the West Midlands, were, and I'm sorry if you've heard this a million times in my other videos, pris, fles, met, fas, got, gos, and mooth. The vowel shift caused a straightforward raising in tongue position of 5 of these vowels, and a diphthongization of the 2 vowels that had the highest tongue position in Middle English, producing pres, fleece, met, fes, goat, goose, and mooth. We have no reason to think this played out differently in the West Midlands versus London. Those vowel qualities must have arrived within decades of Shakespeare's birth, not enough time to broaden into the very wide diphthongs of modern West Midlands accents. Some argument might be made that since West Midlands diphthongs are so wide, I glides all the way from R to Y, and A glides all the way from A to Y. They might have started moving away from their post-vowel shift qualities quickly in order to have enough time to get to the qualities that they're at now. But this doesn't follow. After all, these diphthongs in some varieties of modern London English are just as wide, and yet we have explicit descriptions of those from the early 1600s, which shows that they weren't anywhere near that at the time. In any case, in Shakespeare's time, they were probably very close to the pres, fleece, met, fes, goat, goose, and mooth of London English at the time. There is a bit of wiggle room here. There's some debate as to whether the price and mouth vowels of London English were pres and mouth, or price and mouth, or praise and mouth. I personally think the last one is most likely for London circa 1600. Stratford might have used a different one of those options and we can't really know which, so that might be an accent difference that's invisible to us in retrospect. So that's the basic inventory of vowels, but that's not the only thing that makes an accent distinctive. Which words fall into which vowel categories is also important. To illustrate this with a more modern example, in the 1940s some Cockney speakers would say lot, cloth, coat, but other more conservative speakers would say lot, cloth, coat. Both speakers have the same system of vowels with the distinction between o and o, but they divide the words differently between these vowels. Did West Midlands accents of Shakespeare's day have any interesting differences in how the words fit into vowel categories compared to London at the time? There was a decent amount of West Midlands specific stuff going on in Middle English, but a lot of it had neutralised by 1500, probably under waves of influence from the South East and the East Midlands. Things that may have been lingering in the speech of some conservative speakers were name, shame and lane having the goat vowel, norm, shom, lone, as opposed to the London nam, sham, lan or nam, sham, lan. Likewise, words pronounced man, can, sand in London may still have been mon, con, sond for some older Warwickshire speakers, a holdover from Middle and even Old English, which I don't think survives in Warwickshire today, correct me if I'm wrong. But similar things remain in modern Scots. I don't think there's any evidence that Shakespeare himself did this in poetry. Otherwise, I can't find any indication that lots of words are likely to have fallen into different vowel categories between London and the West Midlands. I get the sense, mostly from this author, that after the immense dialectal diversity of the Middle English period, there was something of a levelling in the southern part of England. Older features retained by regional accents were gradually eroded away, only for new differences to explode after the Great Vowel Shift, giving us our current diversity. This kind of levelling has parallels today. Northern English people in their 80s speak in noticeably different ways 30 or 40 miles apart, but plenty of people in their 20s have accents which are obviously northern but difficult to localise to any particular place. It might be that Shakespeare sat in that sweet spot where London accents and Warwickshire accents were actually fairly similar to each other, although of course there was a lot of local vocabulary which still exists today to differentiate the dialects. But that's only in the things that we can tell from writing. There could have been all kinds of subtleties that made the accent difference obvious to somebody at the time. The pronunciation associated with the letter R is notoriously difficult to pin down. At least sometimes for some people in London it was probably a trill or tap, ra or ra, because we have phonetic descriptions to that effect. There's also some evidence that the London ra weakened if it wasn't at the start of a word, perhaps to something like although that may have come later than Shakespeare's period. The Warwickshire situation could have been different in any number of ways. They could have used taps or trills in all environments, London's rare to Stratford's rare, or they could have used approximants in all environments, London's rare to Stratford's rare. We can be fairly confident that Warwickshire accents were rhotic at this point, pronouncing the R wherever it was written. There's no indication of R loss in Middle English there as far as I know, and Warwickshire speakers born in the 1820s were still largely rhotic. Now, this brings to the fore a piece of evidence that I haven't even mentioned yet. Alexander Ellis, a Victorian phonetician, produced very detailed phonetic transcriptions of regional accents from the 1860s onwards. And he did this in a precursor to the modern International Phonetic Alphabet. He took a transcription from a man who was born in Claverdon in 1824, about 200 years after Shakespeare died, in a village about 8 miles from where Shakespeare was born. This should help us narrow things down even more, and might provide more clarity on the conclusions I've come to in this video so far. Here's my reading of this man's pronunciation. The intonation, the way the speech goes up and down, wasn't recorded, but the actual speech sounds were in a lot of detail. I say, you chaps, you see I'm right now about that little wench coming from school yonder. There's a going down the road there, through the red gate on the left-hand side of the road. Look ye, the child's gone straight up to the wrong house. We'll perhaps find that drunken, deaf-thin and ugged fella as they call Tom, and we all know him very well. Won't the old chop maker know better nor to go there again, poor thing? Look ye, yent it true. This is very ratifying. This isn't identical to the reconstruction we've already come up with, and nor should we expect it to be because it's 250 years later, but it does firmly point in the same direction. The diphthongs of modern West Midlands accents aren't present at all. The goat vowel is or, exactly what we reconstructed for our hypothetical Shakespeare. The put, cut, split is broadly absent, except for the word coming, which doesn't have lip rounding according to Ellis, come in. Otherwise, the words up and drunken are up, drunken. The dress and lot vowels are at the lower end of what I suggested, with the lot vowel actually being quite a bit lower. Dress is and lot seems to range from to o, with no obvious pattern. The face vowel is complex. We can't be sure about any pattern with this smaller sample, but we can match it up to known patterns and speculate. It might be a by default in the middle of a word, straight, make, a at the end of a word, say, and after a velar plosive like g, it might become year, geert. This one might seem so left field that you'd think it was a mistake in Ellis's transcription, but it's actually pretty believable based on other evidence. In the 1600s, there are descriptions of velars, k and g, becoming palatalized if followed by a vowel with the front tongue position. So can is can, get is get, begin is begin in southeastern English accents. This survives today in parts of Ireland, which was largely colonised in the 15 and 1600s. It even survives in pretty young speakers. A fantastic first AD I worked with recently from Donegal did this pretty much all the time, and you can hear it a lot in the series Derry Girls.
And isn't she no sooner out of the car.
Alexander Ellis himself, the guy who took this Warwickshire transcription, said that when he was very young, he remembers very elderly people in the southeast still doing this. So these are people, born in the 1700s, the mid-1700s. So its presence in Warwickshire is completely believable, and the speaker here also does it with the dress vowel in the word again. How this might have been distributed in Shakespeare's time, I'm not sure. If it did exist in London but not in Warwickshire yet, this might have been an obvious and noticeable difference in accent. London's "I can begin" to Shakespeare's "I can begin." But this would be too big an extrapolation to make based on the evidence we have. The narrowness of the price and mouth vowels in Ellis's transcription A and O indicates that they were actually more conservative in Warwickshire in the mid-1800s than London's diphthongs of that era, which were I, ow, or I, ow in London then, depending on the speaker. This is pretty good additional evidence, if it was even needed, that these were not I, ow in Shakespeare's Warwickshire, and it's light evidence that they may have lagged behind the London changes in general, being possibly as narrow as E and O in Shakespeare's day. But this is again maybe pushing the bounds of the evidence a little bit. Ellis transcribes the trap vowel in this Warwickshire accent as being surprisingly back, something like This surprises me, but at least lends credence to the idea that the vowel didn't have a front tongue position for our hypothetical Shakespeare. If Ellis's transcription is accurate, could it possibly have been fairly back in Shakespeare's time? I see no particular reason why not. An unrounded low back vowel would still have fallen into the range that English speakers might choose to spell with the letter A. It makes the short vowel system less symmetrical, but it is possible for systems not to be symmetrical. I just reconstruct a symmetrical system when we don't have other evidence, because symmetricality is a tendency that vowel systems have. But of course this is 250 odd years later, so it's possible Shakespeare was using a. So now I'll read the sonnet in our hypothetical Shakespeare accent. To be clear, many aspects of this reconstruction are very uncertain. I would call this the kind of creative interpretation I'd make for a film which is informed by evidence and reasoned decisions, but by no means 100% definitely accurate. I'll first read it in full, and then read it line by line and compare it with a London accent from the time whose reconstruction we can be more sure about. Those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze wherever ye doth dwell, will ply the tyrants to the very same, and that on fire which firely doth excel, for never resting time laid summer unto hideous winter and confounds him there, sop checked with frost and lusty leaves quite gone, beauty o'ersnowed, and barrenness everywhere. Then, were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor it had no remembrance what it was. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, leaves but their show, their substance still lives sweet. Those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, will ply the tyrants to the very same, and that on fire which firely doth excel, will ply the tyrants to the very same, and that on fire which firely doth excel, for never resting time laid summer on the hideous winter and confounds him there, for never resting time laid summer unto hideous winter and confounds him there, sap checked with frost and lusty leaves quite gone, beauty o'ersnowed and barrenness everywhere. Sop checked with frost and lusty leaves quite gone, beauty o'ersnowed and barrenness everywhere. Then, were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass? Then, were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass? Beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor it nor no remembrance what it was. Beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor it nor no remembrance what it was. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, leaves but their show, their substance still lives sweet. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, leaves but their show, their substance still lives sweet. The phoneticians to whom you refer were purposefully trying to trick modern phoneticians into believing that London accents at the time sounded Irish. What, every single phonetician from the 1600s? Yes, all several dozen of them. Is there a reason that they did this? Yes, they just wanted to play a trick. Why would they do that? Well, for their own amusement. How do you know this is the case? Well, I know for a very simple reason, which is that the accent they describe is not a London accent. I feel your assessment of the evidence is clouded by your supposition that... Leave. But I Bugger think off, leave. You can't accuse us of not having evidence and then dispel it by saying it impressionistically sounds wrong. I've no idea. I frankly had no idea how you're still employed at this university. Reason, which is that the accent they describe is not a London accent. This is a recording of a man from 400 years in your future. Forsooth art mistaken. There be no possibility that a London man shall ever sound as ye say. Why not? He soundeth as a hackney costermonger which hath had a stroke.